Welcome, everyone. This is the 6th talk in our winter speaker series. I'm so glad you could all join us. I'm Moira Yip. I'm on the program committee at the Charlotte Halls Memorial Library here in Lovell. And we're going to ask everyone to stay muted during the talk, but we really are hoping we'll get lots of questions at the end. And if your question comes to you halfway through, do feel free to type it into the chat. And then at the end, we'll unmute everybody and we can put all the faces on screen, and then you can also just wave your hand in the air and we'll take questions that way too. So great pleasure to introduce Kerri Arsenault. I'm so happy that she agreed to do this for us. She's 4th generation, I think, in Mexico, Maine. Mexico is next to Rumford, for those of you who don't know it. And it's nowhere near Paris, Denmark, Sweden, Naples, or the rest of Europe, okay? She left for 20 years or so and then returned regularly. And over those years, she changed, and so did the town. She has deep roots as an Acadian. In fact, she shares a last name with one of our selectmen here in Lovell. We have Janice Arsenault as one of our selectmen. You're probably very distantly related somehow.
I'm sure we are.
And she's the last, her family are the last of a long line of workers in the paper mill that is the center of the story of her book, Milltown. So she's uniquely qualified to understand the town, its environment, its people, and how it's changed. Her book, Milltown, Reckoning with What Remains, won the Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award and the Maine Literary Award for nonfiction. She's had 86 jobs, she says, which is probably we could spend the whole hour asking her to take us through her 86 job career. She's currently a book critic, a teacher, a contributing editor to Orion magazine, and an associate at the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard. And she's working on a new book, which is a biography of Rachel Carson, kinda. She may explain a little more about that later. And she's going to talk about what happens to towns and communities and people when long-term employment patterns change. So her title is Environmental and Family Legacies, a Community Conversation. So with that introduction, it gives me pleasure to hand over to Kerri, who's going to talk for a while and then hold your questions till the end. Hi, Kerri, it's all yours.
Thank you. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll address the 86 jobs. First of all, as she just read, I have like 4 jobs now. So that's 87, 88, 89, 90. You can see how I operate a little bit. And if you do want to, we can talk about that. I also wrote an essay called, weirdly, My 86 Jobs for the New York Review of Books. And it's on my website if you want to read it. I uploaded a whole PDF of it there. If you're interested, and what that is really is about is kind of it's a little subset of the book and sort of about the working class of America and like what it sort of took to stay afloat really since I graduated from high school in 1985 till now, really, and still have like 4 jobs. So so that's that. So I was gonna just do a little talk and sort of seed some questions for you, and also do a short reading with some photographs of new and old pictures. When I was working on the book, I took about 40,000 photos over 10 years or more. Plus there's a lot of old photos that my mother let me borrow or have and borrowed from relatives or websites, or I even got some sent to me. So I'm going to show a mix of photos when I do a reading. And I apologize for the, I will be forwarding them myself manually as I read. So it'll be a little coordinated event. So forgive me if they don't always go like smoothly. So I'll do that. So I will say the beginning or the seed of the book really was, who am I, which is what started the book. And I've said this before, and I'll just briefly say it again to those who haven't read the book or have seen me talk. I had started doing genealogy research in 2001, and I found my grandfather's death certificate and obituary. And I was so curious about it because there were a lot of things in there that I hadn't known about him. So I decided to embark upon clarifying some of those things in there or looking further into them. And what happened was that most of the things in them were wrong. So the book began to have a series of questions, like, why are these records wrong? And what else could be wrong in the history of in archives of history itself? And then I started coming across other things, like or other questions I had, like, why did I never learn about Acadian history when half the phone book shared my same last name and other French Canadian names? Why was everybody in our town seemingly dying of cancer was another thing that I came upon. I mean, it was a lot of these things, and Maine myths and mythologies and monuments, which sort of were questions of themselves. Like, when I say those things, I mean like Paul Bunyan and Muskie, or lobsters, or Hugh Chisholm, who was the founder of our mill, or even Donald Trump, because my book was written partly during the election of Donald Trump. And Trump Tower itself and L.L. Bean, these were monuments and mythologies. And to me, they started to sort of come together in a snowball of things that seemed to be stand-ins for the American dream. Then the biggest question arose was, like, what kind of American dream is one where we have to poison ourselves by the very things that sustain us? And by that, I mean the paper mill, which gave our town life, and also, I believe, a lot of death. And Milltown, I think that a lot of, even though I won the Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award, I think really Milltown is about identity, and more specifically, like I said, environmental and family legacies. And identity has such a symbiotic relationship with place, and there's no place that defines us more than home. So it was like everything was kind of swirling around. This is what was happening in my head, as you can imagine, was swirling around when I began to write this book. And I also realized that we define our landscapes, this landscape of home, with like cars and pollution and mills, but they also define us. If you think about Maine, I think everybody who lives here, almost everybody who lives here, is on this call, lives in Maine, or is from Maine, or somehow has a connection to Maine. And you can see that Maine has defined the people there culturally, economically, socially, physically, emotionally, even religiously. I'd say if you just want to talk about the real landscape, the environmental landscape of trees, right? It's called the pine tree state for a reason. It's 90% forested. And I think it contributes to the cultural values and the social values, like what we do for fun or activities there. Especially in the Lovell area, right? Hunt, fish, boat, hike, ski, all of that. So that forest contributes to our social and cultural values. The woods also define the social life in the way that it's hard to get from one place to another easily with there's no public transportation really to speak of, right? I don't think so. And I think that forces us to seek companionship in different ways than if you lived in New York City or Providence, Rhode Island. Also, the northern Maine woods, which is most of the state, the private lands are in the middle of public parcels, and it's vice versa. So everything's kind of has this weird little separate governance too. So I think that sort of defines us politically. So I'm still talking about how the landscape defines us, and I'm just trying to explain what I mean by that. There's a certain type of person who's attracted to these things or repelled by it. It's also, Maine is isolated from any urban centers. So I think we have to be creative or make do, which affects how people behave. And I think for the most part, what emerges are people who are practical, loyal to close friends and neighbors and family, because that's the main nut of your social life, that closeness, because you're isolated from a lot of other things. And perhaps we're stubborn because we have to be, because we have all this snow, and then we have ice, and then we have mud, and then we have, who knows, I don't know, weather is a problem. Maybe even socially conservative, because the privacy and that isolation makes us so. And this is broad generalizations, but I think there's probably people nodding their head and with sort of understanding. And economically, Maine's forests have been used for centuries for making masts for ships, which I talk about in the book, and then paper. And because those things are going away, well, they don't make masks for ships anymore, but paper certainly is going away. I can't remember what the statistics are now about how many mills have closed since I even wrote the book, and Maine is becoming poorer and poorer because of it, and older. And so that's affecting the state economically. Those woods are affecting the state economically, the landscape, and physically it affects our state, because if we wreck the landscape, it's going to wreck us back. So those are a couple of notes that I wanted to talk. I'm going to do a little reading, and then maybe just talk for a minute about the reading. I'm going to read about Paul Bunyan, who maybe you've all seen driving through Rumford, New Mexico, Maine. And I'll just set this up. This is after I leave this is later in the book. I visit Arthur and Sheila Meter, who own Meter's Funeral Home in Rumford, Maine.
Would you like to share your screen now as well, Kerri?
Yeah, right. Oh, right. See, thank you. Perfect. I'm going to show photographs, some of the 40,000 that I took. Hang in there. Nope. Got it?
Yeah, that works. We got it.
All right, let me just make this bigger. Okay, I'm going to start there. That's my father's birthday cake. So I'm at Sheila and Arthur's home. We just talked about Meter's funeral home too was I think it was fourth generation funeral home. His great-grandfather had started it. 4 generations of Metermen, yep. And James, his son, I should tell you this, it's a really interesting little thing, but when my book was purchased by St. Martin's Press, and I went in to meet my publishers and publicists, I found out that James Meter, the son, was actually my publicist. So that was really wonderful to find out. Okay, so I'm going to read. After I leave Arthur and Sheila's house, I walk over to the tourist information booth parking lot to see the falls. A huge Paul Bunyan statue looms over the river where Bunyan-sized logs once floated downstream toward the mill. In blue pants, a matching blue watch cap, and a short sleeve red polo shirt exposing his brawny arms. Bunyan proffers an equally enormous axe that could clear cut even the Amazon. That statue had been around so long as I remember, although it used to tower above the village shop across the street. I never paid much attention to him despite his size. He blended into the background, as improbable as that seems. Small towns from Maine to Minnesota claim Bunyan as their own, yet everyone agrees the boy giant, oh, there he is right there. The boy giant, I didn't mean to do that, was a hero to all woodsmen. Legend maintains that Bunyan's cradle rocked. When Bunyan's cradle rocked, the motion caused huge waves that sank ships. He also whittled a pipe from a hickory tree and could outrun buckshot. Our Bunyan, I learned, was crafted from the mold of the Muffler Man, a giant fiberglass statue who held mufflers in his outstretched hands as an advertisement in the 1970s. The model was a blank slate for whatever fairy tale we chose. No matter the myth, there our Bunyan stands as a guardian for those ambling through the waning mill town of my youth, whose shadow sometimes as brooding as the hurtling river beyond. He was overhauled between 2000 and 2002, including a paint job, a new axe, and steel supports secured to a huge block of concrete. To add to the new supports, workers had to remove Bunyan's head and shimmy down his neck. Inside his torso, after they assembled his skeleton, workers wriggled up and out of his neck one at a time, like the snakes on a Medusa's head come to life in lumberjack disguise. Then they reattached his head. In honor of the statue's resurrection, Rumford held a festival featuring a lumberjack breakfast, zip lines over the waterfalls, a facial hair contest, flannel shirt dinner dance, and an axe throwing competition. We commemorate resource development and industry with memorials like Bunyan or the marble bust of Chisholm. Chisholm was the founder of our mill. But we don't memorialize the environmental consequences of their work. We keep those legacies hidden in the earth, invisible to the naked eye. What if we began to enshrine those other kind of legacies, the ones that don't want to be found? Quote, here in this spot lies a toxic catastrophe, would be a sign of something we are not yet ready to admit. I'd love to see in the information booth some real information, a pamphlet outlining the path of mercury, dioxin, and other toxics that are part of our heritage too. Or maybe an interactive feature like they created for the Old Man of the Mountain, so future generations could see what the world was like before we choked it with garbage that contains the half-life of a zillion years. I wonder what kind of festival we'd have for such dangerous shrines as those, if we bother to maintain their perpetual care as lovingly as we shored up Bunyan's spine. Down at the river's edge, I see Ed Muskie's smaller, more serious memorial of squat, dark gray granite. Bookish and 6'4", he was a giant in real life, although painfully shy, and smart, so smart that as a student, he was asked more than once to substitute for his teachers. He pushed to overcome his shyness, a flaw he wore like a hair shirt, yet it vanished when he stood in front of a chalkboard or in front of the debate team, which he joined despite his reticence. When I was young, my grandmother Bridget dated Muskie, but I can't imagine the couple. He with his stooped quietness and a card-carrying Boy Scout, and my grandmother, an explosive miniature force, like BB gun shot, scattered but sharp, all at the same time. Muskie always saw both sides to every argument, the kind of guy who went hunting as a kid, but would never shoot anything. Chris Matthews in the Sarasota Herald Tribune in 1966 said of Muskie, quote, he did not enter politics to have his sentences appear in the newspaper. He sought an election to make the country better, unquote. So Muskie adopted a tailor's mien and went to work. His father was a tailor. Against a resistant president and House of Representatives and industry in action, he helped enact the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, trying to answer a question he often asked himself. How do you create an environment people can enjoy while protecting it? In Rumford, however, Muskie was no match for the silhouette cast by Bunyan. Both giants memorialized and their acts equally significant. However, one deforested the woodlands and the other tried to reclaim them, the rocky pools on the edge of the Androscoggin spanning the gap between them. My father used to make fun of Bunyan and the ludicrous blue hoof prints made by Babe, Bunyan's blue sidekick ox, that started at the information booth and colored the sidewalks all through town, the same sidewalks they were planning to tear up and replace. The Rumford Selectmen had voted in 2009 to use $6,500 from their Economic Development Fund to create Babe, figuring he would encourage tourists to follow his meandering line through town. What they forgot to consider that there's not much left in town to see but Bunyan himself and those garish blue hoof prints that end abruptly at Rite Aid. When we leave home, we leave behind our past, and when we return, we encounter a version of home built of legends, true and false. For me, those legends are so big: Chisholm, Muskie, Thoreau, Longfellow, Bunyan, Black Mountain, Anne of Green Gables, my family, and trees, endless trees, that it's hard to see beyond their shadows. So every time I drive back over the Piscataqua River Bridge with Mexico and Rumford in my rearview mirror, I may not see true love as E.B. White said he did, but I can see where my lifelines are drawn.
That was lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And the photos are amazing. Anyway, please keep talking.
It was funny because I was distracted by looking at them. Sorry if my reading, I was like, oh, and knowing that my mother was watching too. And so there were a lot of her in there. Her pregnant on the porch, her walking down the street and her when she was crowned Winter Carnival Queen. I saw that one out of the corner of my eye too. Yeah, so the other thing I guess I wanted to say was part of the reason I wrote this book too, or it became part of the reason I wrote this book, was because I felt like not only had this story not been told, which surprised me, sort of the working class of America and up and down the East Coast, especially, you know, and part of that being the French Canadian story. But there were also, I'm a book critic too, and I started to read a lot of environmental books, and I realized that a lot of them delivered information instead of telling stories. And I thought, how can I tell an environmental story that is kind of not obviously an environmental story, or not, I'm telling a story rather than giving information. And so it's something I tried to do with this book, because, and it was also it's a tricky environmental story to tell these kind, because there's no aha moment in this book at all. And that's the thing about toxic disasters like these. They are decentralized and hard to pin down where they begin and where they end. Like, can you say where the pollution of our town began and end? You can't. And can you really know if the pollution has caused the cancer in a town? You can't, because people move, they get cancer. People stay, they get cancer. Or they stay and they move and they don't get cancer. It's really hard to determine. And toxic disasters like these are slow and ambiguous in nature and reach, and are largely out of sight and out of the news. They're not even what we think of disasters, really, or news at all, which is why they don't make the news. So I was trying to say, like, how can I write this story that felt important, but not spectacular in the newsy kind of way? Anyway, in doing that, as you can see, it was a wandering path that I took in gathering all this information through all the things I've been talking about, and sort of the structure of the book took on that sort of meandering path. And I realized too that the structure of the book was mimicking the sort of structure of our river, which is on the cover of the book. It was meandering just like I am right now. But that's the way I think too. So it you know, structures of books emerge through the material that you gather and through the mind of the writer. So those two things also happen. And when I was doing that, I was compiling all these things and thinking about all the different things I've talked about, I realized that my family's story was a much bigger story, and it was intertwined with the environmental history of the United States, really. And it's contained, it's just a microcosm of what's happening all across America and all across the world, really. I mean, I've talked to people, I've talked to a library in Germany and Helsinki and London, and it's no different. Because industry, you know, the fundamental need for bodies to be respected has always been at odds with industry's goals. History has shown these abuses to be true, no matter where you live, or no matter what century, from the cotton fields of Virginia to the paper mills of Maine. Industry can be a conveyor belt for disease and disenfranchisement, even if you don't work in the mill, because my paper mill is in your blood. And we can talk about that if you want later. But being a mill worker was also part of our identity and our culture. As I said, you know, that forest and those woods are part of who we are too. So it's a conundrum, I think. And I'm not sure what the answers are, but I sure have a lot of questions. As I hope you do too. That's a great segue.
Okay, so I'm reading this as you'd like to segue to a dialogue rather than keep talking yourself.
I would. I mean, I can keep talking, but I would love people to. I don't want to put people asleep either.
No. Well, I don't think that's an issue. I wouldn't worry about that at all. Well, thank you very much for getting us started. I thought it was a wonderful book. I loved it. I know it just fascinated me. And I have all kinds of questions, but my questions can wait for now. And I think we should start. Let's open this up. I'll change my view to the gallery, and let's unmute people.
I should also ask, if, like, how many people have read it? I'm not testing you, and if you haven't read it, that's okay. But I would love to see a show of hands or in the chat. Okay, so far everybody that's on video has read it, so that's good. Because it becomes a different conversation, I think. You know, like.
Well, so let me get the ball rolling with an extremely rambling question. But for those of you who haven't read it, it might give you a sense of the sort of flavor of the book that came across to me. There are just many, many threads that run through this book. So there are negative, sad things. I wrote this down because it was so complicated. Negative, sad things like environmental and health damage, loss of water sovereignty, powerlessness in the face of corporate and international changes. And then there are strong and positive things, pride in one's work, the loyalties to a tight-knit community, an awareness of heritage and family and neighborhood ties. So there's this complex balance, or balance, tension. And so I sort of, before this evening started, I wrote, what gave birth to your book? Or was this complicated, interwoven structure? Because it doesn't meander as a book, it's structured.
It is structured.
But it's structured because it is this knit together collection of strands. And did that emerge as you wrote, or did you write out a complicated map with a lot of intertwined things, or did it come into being that way?
Yeah, both. I tried so many. I would just start writing. It was meandering at first, and I just would start writing, and then I'd say, I don't even know, why am I writing about this? But I just kept going with it, and then I would go to its natural end and sort of come back, and I would go and I would come back, and I would go and I would come back. And then I realized, oh, that's interesting, because that's exactly what I'm doing, going home and leaving and returning and leaving and returning and leaving, right? So my research was going out and coming back, but that research was mirroring my actual journey home and back, which actually mirrors my perspective into the community, which was to say, I don't live there anymore. So I have this outsider perspective, but I also have an insider perspective because I grew up there. My relatives live there, ancestors are buried there. So that tension, I think is the right word, exists on sort of all levels of the book. And it also exists between the past and the present. I think the first half of the book really takes place more in the past, describing the history of the town in a way and sort of tackling and wrestling with that. And then sort of in the middle of the book is when my father dies, because it actually happened in the middle of me writing the book. And then after that, it was more about, okay, now what is going to happen to this town, to my family, to the mill, So that tension parallel there. It also was structured carefully so that chapter 16 sort of speaks to chapter 1 and chapter 15 speaks to chapter 2. So those ties.
I didn't pick up on that at all.
No, nobody would. It's just something I know. But like I made it kind of linked a little so that what it says is the past determines your future, So if those things are linked, and I was trying to link them. So while it might seem meandering, some people feel frustrated by it, feels meandering, but I think like a river, it does move forward. It just goes down different paths depending on sort of the debris in the way, and doing genealogy, you find a lot of debris, right? And that's how this started, really was a genealogical thing. So yeah, that sort of, that research going out and back, it made me realize that that's what I was actually doing, leaving home. And the leaving home and the coming back is part of identity too, right? Like you said in your introduction, I came back to a place, I had changed and the place had changed, but also the people there had changed. Some didn't. and then their perception of me changed and some did not. So all of those are things that determine your identity. We all like to think that, we determine who we are. It's not true. Like your environment does, people you love to help determine your identity. So all of those things were sort of snowballing into this issue of identity for me. And that back and forth motion was a real big part of it, because each time I would go home, actually it would change, it would move and adjust and be different, Like one time I go home, my mother's playing the harmonica. Like, I don't know, I'm just laughing at her. Or one time, and then the other time my father is sick, and each time that's a different relationship to him, and, seeing him dying or whatever. There's just so many ways that we change. And that's all to say that identity is constantly changing. You aren't one thing. You're like in motion all the time. So does that help answer it? It's
Yes,
a great question. Thank you.
It does help answer it. So only some of you have got your faces on screen, but if you have and you'd like to ask a question, just wave your hands around. Tim, I don't know how to say it, Sir, that would be the French pronunciation. You're muted at the moment, Tim. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Got it. Okay.
There you go.
Hi.
I didn't have so much for a question as I do just a comment. I did really enjoy the book. And in so many ways, Kerri, I do have one kind of a question here, but obviously I'm an Acadian as well. And I did the same thing, the genealogy route, and found that there's actually a lot of information on Acadian genealogy. And I'm sure that you've seen some of the sites. It's really incredible. I never knew about that growing up. I knew I was Acadian, or knew her French, but I didn't know anything about the Acadian stuff. So on so many levels.
That we didn't. I mean, why didn't we? And did you grow up in northern Maine, or no?
No, I'm actually kind of a hybrid, because I was born in Maine, and we lived in a town in South Paris, and my grandfather and my father worked in a factory where the whistle blew. They went to the factory, whistle blew, they came home at lunch. And I remember thinking when I was 10 years old, I will kill myself if I ever have to live like that. It just wasn't something I wanted to do. But at the same time, and you probably feel some of the same conflict, do you consider yourself working class or middle class? Because it's hard to get to a point where you feel good about being middle class, because you go to college, which is, you're probably the first one, you're probably first generation college. And you're probably in the back of your head, maybe not so much because you're a woman, but you feel like if you're not working with your hands, then you have less worth.
No, I think that's a great point. And that's what, when I was talking about that essay, my 86 job, I think that's exactly what that's about, is me wrestling with a little bit with the issue of class, to say, because too, in the book, as you might have noticed, I used it tonight too. And I think about it when I use it, is I use the we when I speak about the working class, because that's where my values are from. Yeah, I'm not working class because I'm not working with my hands in that way. I don't take like somebody had a great way to describe working class, is like, you take a shower after work instead of before work, which I love that description. It kind of, it's a very good summary of it. But and I don't do that anymore. And I live in a nice house and like a posh town, and whatever. I mean, my husband was in the military. I wouldn't say we were too fancy, but it's an interesting thing, because I've even had some people sort of question my belonging of that class. And as the book also talks about, is like, you know what, I get to choose, really. Nobody gets to choose for me which class I belong to, or where I'm from. Some people accuse me of not being from there. Well, actually I am from, because for me, where I'm from and what class I am from is, I think, just the part of your value system. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
And I think that I also wanted to make a note of when you said there's so much information about Acadian genealogy. And I feel like it's because we lost our country and were victims of a genocide. as simple as that. There is no place to go back to. There is no Acadia. It doesn't exist anymore. And I think there's a real, I think this generational trauma there in some way, like everybody just kind of wanting to know answers about that and wanting to call a plate, like wanting to pin down speaking of home, that is like the ancestral home, if you want to call it that. And we don't have it. So it makes sense that there's a lot of genealogy going on about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have, so there's a couple of things in the chat that I thought I'd go to next. They're not really questions. Let's take the first one, and then maybe we'll take another question and then go back. So this is a comment from Carol Gautreau-Bent. Carol, I'm very sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong. But she says, I haven't read this book yet, but my grandmother's sister moved to Rumford from PEI around the turn of the century to work the paper mills. And my grandmother and two other sisters moved to the Boston area around the same time to work the rubber mills. We visited our cousins in Rumford for years in the 1950s and had fond memories, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. We have lost touch with our Maine relatives, but I wonder if the paper mill had an effect on their health. Probably. I wish my parents and grandparents were still around to ask questions. So
yeah, there's a couple things I would love to comment on. Thanks,
yeah, absolutely.
First of all, you should put their names, because my mother's on this call and she might know them, who those people are. It would be kind of interesting to know, especially the 50s. My mother was born in 42. Sorry, Mom, just outed you there. But she looks great. My mother looks great, by the way. Also, probably the mill had an effect on their health. I mean, it really, the studies have shown that things that come out of paper mills, and not just, you didn't have to just work in the paper mill. The mill pollution doesn't stay where we put it. It goes in the air, it goes in the water, it goes in our fish, it goes in our meat, and it goes in our cheese. And I know that some of you have probably seen the newspaper articles recently in Maine about the PFAS chemicals being found in the sludge on farms. Well, that sludge contains paper mill dioxin too, and they're not really talking about it, and I don't know why, but that's the research I found and wrote about in the book. And it's just as dangerous, if not more so, than PFAS chemicals. It is also, they spread it on baseball fields all over the state. So the farms is spread all over the state, all over baseball fields, all over the woods. There's a few passages in my book where I talk about that. So yeah, I think that one thing I learned is that I wish I would have asked people more questions too before they died. And I tried to during the book. And I think if I look at my acknowledgements in the book, I think that I'm going to look really quickly, because a lot of people died as I was writing the book, including my father. Let's see, there was a whole list of them. Yes. Everyone who died while I wrote this book that are in the book: my father, Wilma Belanger, Dot Bernard, Doris Godden, Don Gilbert, Ron Hemingway, Edmund Morris, Jenny Orr, Dan St. Cyr, and Kathy Taylor. I'm sure there are others. So ask questions.
Well, Carol Gautreau-Bent has just typed the names of her family into the chat. So if either you or your mother recognize the names, maybe you can somehow get in touch with her.
I'll read them out loud in case anybody else does. May Arsenault and their daughter was Tessie, married a Blaisdell. There
you go. If anybody knows, then you need to get in touch with Carol. Carol, if you'd like to hear back from anyone, put your email in the chat so people know how to reach you. Now, the other comment in the chat, I'm going to take it now because it relates very directly to something you've just been talking about. So I'm sorry if you're waiting to ask a question. Don't worry, you will still have time. But this comment goes as follows, from Bruce Taylor, and it says, history repeats itself. Metallic mining in Maine will be insidious, pernicious, and persistent also, not only contaminating our watersheds, but airsheds also. Like PFAS, the leftover waste is full of toxic metals and will be biologically and chemically indestructible. They provide very few good jobs, but leave a very expensive mess for us to clean up. So
Yeah,
I
I mean,
just realized, Bruce, and I do apologize that you didn't send this to everyone. It came just to me. So I'm
I was
sorry.
I saw it too, and I was gonna read it
I
anyway
apologize. Okay.
because it's a really good comment.
Yeah.
But I think it's true, and it's this is all to say that there's so much short-sightedness in our leadership to allow these things to happen. And I don't blame the mill, because they really, well, maybe they're doing illegal things, or maybe they did, but generally they're following the rules that are set out by them. And so really, a lot of people always ask me, what can we do? And I just say, vote for leaders who want you to live. Like that's the most direct thing you can do. I mean, I'm not an activist. I'm not that I'm not going to march in anything, but I think voting and reaching out to your leaders is really the most important thing you can do, or serving on your own small town committees that are allowing. So, like, in my book, I talk about Nestle, sovereignty of water, and what can happen if you don't show up at your water district meetings. A lot of things can happen while you're not looking. So I highly recommend. And if you don't have time, this is another solution you can do, is get a group of you, like maybe you have 10 friends and one person goes every month. So you don't have to go to every meeting, and they just report back and send a little report.
Nikki Sakara gave a talk for us here at the library last year, actually, so about the water.
Nikki and I became good friends, yes, during that.
Exactly. No, I know. I mean, I noticed in the book that you had talked to her. So let's see. I'm looking for hands in the air for more questions. Fred Demers, did I say that right, Fred? Anyway, and you're muted at the moment. You'll have to unmute yourself.
And I saw you, Pam, there. So
there you go. Fred, we're not hearing you. I don't know why. You don't seem to be muted, but we're still not hearing you.
Test your speaker, Fred. Maybe you have your speaker off.
No, now it says you're unmuted, so we should be able to hear you, but say something.
Go to your preferences in your computer and check that you have your computer speaker selected.
Microphone.
Yeah. I mean, microphone. Maybe he can't hear us.
Could you type into the chat, Fred? Could you type something into the chat? That would be good.
Sorry.
If you're not familiar with the chat, at the very bottom of your screen, if you move your cursor down, it'll say chat. No? Okay. Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. I'm looking for hands. We have more hands in the air.
Pam Karen had some.
Okay. Pam, sorry, Pam, I missed you. Pam, please.
No problem. So I had a couple things. First of all, our book club is reading your book right now. So it's really, really
thank you.
Yeah. So I'm loving it. And I'm Acadian as well. So everything that you're talking about means a lot. I live in northern Maine, right in the St. John Valley. So Madawaska, Maine has a mill. It's a mill town as well. Yeah. And so it too has been called Cancer Valley. So I resonated with that. But I was just curious in your research if you had done just your mill, because I haven't read the whole book yet, or if you looked at other mills in Maine, and if you know anything specifically about the St. John Valley, because we're always told that, it's the farmers and it's the pesticides that were put on the potatoes, or it's because you live in a valley. And so everything, like just air pollution just kind of hangs there, doesn't really have anything to do with the mills. And just curious to know if you come across those sorts of comments, or if you know anything about the St. John Valley.
I would say that almost everything that I read about in our mill is applicable to Madawaska. Okay. Even though I directly did not research it, because I thought about it. I thought, wow. And then the book would be like 1 million pages long.
Right.
But I think we too lived in the valley. I heard the same kind of comments growing up. I saw it in the newspaper. All the same kind of things you're saying, oh, it's this, oh, it's not that, it's this. But I would say everything you're reading there is, I can almost guarantee it's applicable to Madawaska.
Right. Yeah.
They were built around the same time. It's got the same the same mentality, the same kind of everything, really.
Yeah.
Who owns the mill there now? Do you know?
No, I don't. It's not someone from the area that I do know for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
And these mills never were, which is the
Yeah.
interesting thing. They, Hugh Chisholm was the founder of a mill, but he never lived there. He lived on Park
Mhm.
Avenue,
Yeah.
or Fifth Avenue, I should say. Yeah.
We have like 5 little girls in our area right now that have cancer, and it's prevalent. Everybody in our family has died of cancer, and it's just really interesting for sure.
Yeah, and it's so problematic because it's really hard to prove. Even scientists, never mind like me or somebody who has like a full-time other job or whatever, it's like, this is part of the problem too, is that just ordinary people, why is the burden put on us to have to prove that these chemicals are unsafe? Like
I
in
was told
Europe,
because we eat fiddlehead.
well, in Europe,
Animals don't eat fiddlehead, so it's got to be that. Animals don't eat
is
fiddlehead.
that something somebody's really said?
Yeah, animals do not eat fiddlehead, and we eat a lot of fiddlehead in the valley. And that comes from the water, which is contaminated. And stop eating fiddlehead, and you guys won't have cancer.
Contaminated by the mill.
Unbelievable.
That is unbelievable. I can't even remember what I was going to say. That's just the craziest thing I've ever heard.
Now, Fred, who's couldn't get his microphone to work, but he's typed his question into the chat, so we can ask his question. So Fred's question is: I grew up in Winslow in the shadow of Scott paper. I appreciate the research you did, and I think this is a question. And was it hard? And did you hit any roadblocks? And what kept you coming back to your work?
Yeah. Well, you heard what Pam just said. I mean, those are the kind of roadblocks I would hit, is that actually, I was talking to, maybe it was last night. Yeah, I was in Manchester, Connecticut, and somebody asked me that question. Every single thing was a roadblock. Literally everything was, just, I would say, first of all, like ordinary people doing, yes, I'm a writer, but did I have any scaffolding or academic organization or a magazine to back me up and help me do this complex research? I'm not a scientist. I don't know anything about that. So I had to just put away 10 years of my life and do it. And it's not even to say it's ever been finished. It's just, it was constant. And the stuff was coming in from people would send me things, and I'd be try to look up journal articles, for instance. Just an academic scientific study or a journal article costs like $47 per journal article. So I would have to steal them, basically. I had to borrow college students' passwords so I could download a bunch of stuff at a time. So just the access is a problem, was one. And then I didn't so much try to interview the mill or anything like that, because I feel like for so many years their story had been told and I wanted to tell a different story. Some people are frustrated by that, I think. Why didn't you talk to the mill? I'm like, because I know what their story, I know what they're going to say. They've already said it. And the roadblock, even at the EP, at the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, I went there, and wonderful, nice people. They weren't there to roadblock me, but I'd say, I want these files. And they'd be like, oh, here's a bunch of files. And the files look like this. Imagine if you just have tons of paperwork and you put it all in your outbox and you stack it there, and somebody comes and picks it up and takes it down to the file room and just puts it in a file. There's nobody organizing those files. They're just picked up and put in a file. And then I open them up one year and try to make sense of them. I mean, it's really hard. So now I understand when you have a request for information from the DEP or any other governmental organization, they're like, can you be very specific? That's why, because the files are a mess. And that's not to blame the DEP. They're probably underfunded, understaffed. I mean, so there's just so many roadblocks. And I guess what kept me going back is just, I'm a very curious person, and I was already knee deep in this, and I just, that's the way I am. I grew up in the working class, work, work, work. You know, hard work pays off, and it did. So I don't really like to give up on anything. I also grew up as an athlete, you know, and I think playing sports teaches you a lot about perseverance. So.
Thank you. Okay, I see Jo Radner has her hand up. Jo.
So.
I'm very sorry that I haven't had a chance to read Milltown yet, so this is probably something you've covered thoroughly, and if it is, I'm going to read it anyway. But I'm curious, as a person who's been long familiar with the way that Maine people, my family in particular, uses words like "it's interesting" or "it's complicated." To deflect things that might be emotionally disturbing. I'm wondering if you could say something about the emotional heritage for people of the Mill experience now.
That's interesting. I didn't specifically write about that, but I did write about language in particular, and the one word I did take on was the word pride, which was something, you know, we had a lot of pride, that kind of thinking. But I would say the emotional heritage of that is kind of goes back to what I was saying. Well, maybe I did write something about that now that I'm thinking about it. You know, Acadians and French Canadians came down from Canada to work in these mills. And they were a huge part of the Industrial Revolution. They were Catholic, they were loyal, they were seen as subservient in some ways, and that was only because they were loyal and Catholic and hardworking. So mill managers saw them as subservient, and I think some of that could be attributed to that heritage. I think that it could also be attributed to, like I was talking about earlier, sort of we live in an isolated state and we don't communicate in the same ways that people from urban areas or more populated areas do. I know in my family it was always, you know, don't, you know, say what you have to say and get out, you know, kind of way. But I really think this, I mean, I'm just guessing here. There's probably studies on this, but I have a feeling, and I did write something about in the book, and I can't remember exactly because I have a terrible memory, but I did write about how that French Canadian culture really affected how people, and I actually believe there is such thing too as generational trauma. I mean, if you think about the generational reach, so I knew my great-grandmother, I was very young, and she knew her great-grandmother. So like whatever that goes back to, 17 something, that's kind of a long reach. And the genocide of the Acadians was 1755. So I actually feel like I could reach back with my arm and almost touch somebody there. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not that far away. And I feel like, and not to say that they suffer. I mean, the Arsenaults, I mean, I have Acadians on both sides of my family and it's French Canadians too. That's not to say they necessarily were, my direct descendants suffered, but they did hide in the woods in Prince Edward Island when all the ships were expelling everybody. And then they started repopulating, the Arsenaults did. So that's an interesting, I mean, imagine like being so terrified that you had to hide in the woods and, you know, probably worried every single night thereafter if somebody was coming to get you. Like that's a real trauma to live with. And then to just kind of pass that kind of strain onto, whether it's your genes expressing themselves in a traumatic way or just like emotionally traumatic and, you know, being brought up. So I got to believe that there's something in that.
There is.
Yeah.
Kerri, I'm going to take the host's prerogative here to ask you the final question, because we're going to have to begin to close this down. So given all of these things you've talked about, I'm very curious as to what the reaction within Rumford and Mexico was to your book. Did people see you as a heroine, a champion? I should say hero these days, shouldn't I? I think I'm not supposed to say heroine anymore. Or did they see you as a traitor who was sort of washing the dirty linen in public of their town? You know, or probably both, but I would be very curious about these reactions.
I think that on balance, it was, I think it was taken positively, you know. I know for sure by all the people in the book, which I should say all the people in the book were people that have meant something to me. And I knew most of them. So it was a little bit of a journalistic faux pas to like go and interview and talk to people, you know, but I did it because they were important to me and they were comfortable with what the book was about. And to me, that meant a lot. And I think that their being comfortable sort of spread through the town. Sure, there were people that were like, oh, this is so negative about the town. And, you know, Janet Mills said the same thing, who hasn't, yeah, which is weird because part of that is part of the problem was like the silence and something that Joe was just talking about, that silence permeated our town. And then this book was trying to break that silence. And if people are still saying, oh, we don't want to talk about the negative things, like it doesn't exist. It's just, it's part of the problem. So there were a few people, but they didn't contact me directly. So I'm happy.
Well, so are we, Kerri. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Before we say a complete goodbye to Kerri, let me just say that our next Zoom speaker is Carol Dana. She's the cultural historian of the Penobscot Nation. And her talk on Thursday, the 17th of March at 7 p.m., she'll present Atlokwe, I'm not sure if I said that right, Atlokwe, Tell Me a Story. She draws on a collection of 189 Penobscot stories traditionally told in the wintertime about the cultural hero Gluskabe, and she will tell stories and discuss their significance. So I think that should be another
sounds great.
Fascinating evening, shouldn't it? Well, join us, Kerri.
I might.
Yeah. So I think with that, thank you all very much for coming. I hope I caught everybody's raised hands and got your questions. And especially thank you, Kerri. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Great evening. Thank your mother. Thank you very much to your mother for joining us.
Yeah, Maddie, she's right there, Maddie in the middle. If anybody has questions, my email is on my website too. You can contact me.
You may live to regret that. You may get overwhelmed.
You know, surprisingly, I say to every audience, and I don't get overwhelmed. I get very, very interesting conversations.
Oh, and I forgot to tell people that you told me you used to come ice fishing on Keyser Lake when you were a kid.
I sure did when I was a kid. I sure did.
So she knows our town.
Don't trust the ice this year.
I was just going to say, I've fallen through the ice there many, many times.
That's not funny.
But when it's layered like that, you know, you fall through the first layer. It's terrifying.
My beagle fell through the other day. I thought I was going to have to sacrifice my life to save her, but she managed to get herself out, luckily. So.
No, thank you, everybody. Really.
Thank you, Kerri.